What happens when the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy dismiss humanity as primitive scavengers? What occurs when they laugh at our ancient junk and call our greatest achievements worthless relics? The Galactic Council made that mistake once. They pointed at humanity's prized possession, a massive, seemingly dead warship drifting in the void, and declared it nothing more than scrap metal from a bygone era. They mocked our attachment to what they saw as obsolete technology, calling us sentimental fools clinging to the past. But the galaxy has a way of humbling the arrogant, and humanity, well, we've always been good at proving people wrong. This is the story of the day the laughter died. The day an ancient relic reminded the galaxy why some sleeping giants should never be awakened. The day the Galactic Council learned that sometimes the old ways aren't just better, they're absolutely terrifying. Buckle up, you're about to witness why humanity doesn't just survive in this galaxy, we make it our own. The viewing chamber of the Galactic Council's primary station buzzed with barely contained excitement. Representatives from 12 of the galaxy's most powerful species had gathered for what promised to be the most entertaining spectacle in decades. Through the massive, transparent aluminum windows, they could see it floating in the distance like a sleeping behemoth, the human warship Endurance. Ambassador of the Hegemony clicked his mandibles in amusement as he studied the vessel through his personal scanner. The ship was enormous, easily 3 kilometers from bow to stern, but it looked like something that had crawled out of a museum. Its hull was a patchwork of different metals, some sections clearly older than others, welded together with what appeared to be primitive techniques. Gun barrels of various sizes protruded from its surface like the spines of some ancient sea creature, and its overall design screamed of functionality over elegance. "Look at this monstrosity," said to his fellow ambassadors, his translator rendering his chittering laughter into standard Galactic. "The humans actually believe this relic can compete with our modern fleets. It's almost sad how attached they are to their outdated technology." Ambassador of the Crystalline Dominion hummed in agreement, her crystal form refracting the light in patterns that indicated mirth. "My scanners show energy signatures that are at least 500 years old. Some sections appear even older. They've literally built a museum piece and called it a warship." The human delegation sat quietly at their assigned table, seemingly unbothered by the mockery. Ambassador Sarah, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war, simply sipped her coffee and watched the alien representatives with an expression of mild interest. Beside her, Admiral drummed his fingers silently on the table, his weathered face betraying nothing. "Perhaps," suggested Ambassador On of the Void touched, his tentacles writhing with what passed for humor among his species, "we should simply declare the humans the winners now and save everyone the embarrassment. After all, that ship is certainly the most historically significant vessel any of us have brought." This triggered another wave of laughter throughout the chamber. The Galactic Council had organized this demonstration as a show of force, an opportunity for each member species to display their most advanced warship. The humans had shocked everyone by bringing what appeared to be an antique. Ambassador finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite its quiet tone. "You know, Admiral here served on that ship for 15 years. Perhaps he could tell you a bit about its history." The alien ambassadors exchanged glances. This was unexpected. Usually the humans remained silent during these gatherings, speaking only when directly addressed. Admiral stood slowly, his movements betraying his age but none of his resolve. "The Endurance was commissioned during the colony wars," began, his voice rough from decades of command. "That was about 800 years ago when humanity first started expanding beyond our home system. She's seen more combat than any other ship in our fleet." 800 years? Could barely contain his amusement. "No wonder it looks so primitive. Most of our species replace their warships every 50 years. "Replacement," said, turning to look directly at the Hegemony ambassador, "assumes that the original was inadequate." The chamber fell slightly quieter, but the condescending smiles remained. Continued, apparently unperturbed by the audience's attitude. "The Endurance has been upgraded continuously throughout her service life. New weapons systems, new defensive measures, new propulsion technology, all integrated into her existing framework. What you see isn't a museum piece. It's a ship that has adapted and evolved with every major technological advancement humanity has made." Ambassador's crystal form shifted to patterns of skepticism. Surely you cannot expect us to believe that constant modification could make an 800-year-old ship competitive with modern vessels. The fundamental design limitations alone would make such a thing impossible. The fundamental design, Admiral said with the faintest hint of a smile, was built to accommodate expansion and modification. We designed the Endurance not as a finished product, but as a platform that could grow. How delightfully primitive, On said, his tentacles writhing faster. Building with the expectation of obsolescence, our ships are designed to perfection from the moment they leave the construction yards. Perfection, mused, is a terminal state. Once something is perfect, it cannot be improved. The Endurance was never intended to be perfect. She was intended to be alive. This statement caused actual confusion among the assembled ambassadors. Several of them activated their translators, certain that something had been lost in the conversion to Galactic standard. Alive asked, "Are you speaking metaphorically?" Before could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the station. The assembled ambassadors looked around in confusion as the lights dimmed and emergency illumination kicked in. Station commander, a towering member of the Apex Confederation, burst into the chamber. "We have a problem," he announced without preamble. "Long-range sensors have detected a Scourge fleet approaching this system. 50 vessels, including at least 3 dreadnoughts. They'll be here within 6 hours." The chamber erupted into chaos. The Scourge were the galaxy's boogeyman, a nomadic species that consumed entire worlds, stripping them of all useful resources before moving on. No one had seen them in this sector for over a century. "How is that possible?" demanded. "Our intelligence networks would have detected such a large fleet movement weeks ago." "They're using some kind of stealth technology we haven't seen before," replied grimly. "Our outer monitoring stations never saw them coming. The first warning we got was when they dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system." Was already accessing his personal communicator. "I'm calling for my fleet to retreat immediately. We cannot face the Scourge with a handful of demonstration vessels." "Agreed," said On. "This exhibition is over. We need to evacuate immediately." Similar calls for retreat echoed throughout the chamber as each ambassador contacted their respective fleets. The carefully orchestrated demonstration had turned into a potential massacre. Ambassador had remained seated throughout the panic, still calmly drinking her coffee. When the chaos died down slightly, she finally spoke. "Admiral, what's the status of our ship?" Checked his wrist communicator. "All systems nominal, Ambassador. The crew is awaiting orders." Crew stared at the humans in disbelief. "You brought a crew to a peaceful demonstration." "The Endurance has never operated without a crew," explained. "She wasn't built for automated systems. Every function, every weapon, every decision requires human oversight." "How absurdly inefficient," said, though her attention was clearly divided between the conversation and her own fleet's withdrawal preparations. "Our vessels operate with minimal crew requirements. Full automation is far superior to relying on biological operators." Admiral stood and walked to the viewing window, gazing out at the distant shape of the human warship. In the emergency lighting, it looked even more ancient and battle-scarred than before. 50 Scourge vessels, she mused aloud. "Including dreadnoughts, that's enough firepower to level a small planet." "Which is why we're all leaving," said firmly. "I suggest your people do the same. That antique of yours won't last 5 minutes against modern Scourge weaponry." Turned back to face the assembled ambassadors. "What if I told you that the Endurance has faced the Scourge before?" The chamber fell silent. The Scourge had been absent from this sector for over a century, and most species had no recent combat experience against them. "When?" Commander demanded. 237 years ago, answered. "Battle of Skate. The Scourge sent a fleet to harvest the colony worlds there. The Endurance was part of the defense force." Part of? On's tentacles had stopped writhing, a sign of serious attention among his species. "The entire defense force," corrected quietly. "One ship against 43 Scourge vessels." The ambassadors stared at the humans in disbelief. No single vessel, no matter how advanced, could face such odds and survive. "That's impossible," stated flatly. "The mathematics simply don't work. No ship can generate enough firepower to engage that many enemies simultaneously." "You're thinking like your ships think," said. Maximum efficiency, optimal firing solutions, perfect coordination between automated systems. The Scourge fight the same way, precise, calculated, predictable. And that's a weakness, asked. Against the endurance, yes. Walked to the window and pointed at the distant warship. Every weapon system on that ship is manually controlled. Every targeting decision is made by a human brain. Every tactical choice is adapted in real time by human intuition. The ship doesn't follow optimal algorithms, it follows human instinct. Instinct is inferior to calculation, protested. Is it? Asked. Tell me, Ambassador, when your automated systems encounter a completely unprecedented situation, something they weren't programmed to handle, what do? Didn't answer immediately. The question struck at one of the fundamental limitations of artificial intelligence, the inability to truly adapt to completely unknown scenarios. They analyze available data and extrapolate the most likely successful response, he finally said. And if that response is wrong, they adapt based on the results and try again. How long does that take? The question hung in the air. In space combat, adaptation time was measured in milliseconds. Ships that took too long to adjust to new situations became debris. Admiral's communicator chimed. He glanced at it and nodded too. The Scourge fleet has been detected by our sensors. Estimated arrival in 5 hours, 40 minutes. Then we should go, said urgently. There's no shame in tactical retreat when facing impossible odds. You're right, agreed. There's no shame in retreat, but there's also no honor in abandoning a system full of innocent civilians to the Scourge. The chamber fell silent again. The truth was that the station was deep in civilized space, surrounded by dozens of populated worlds. If the Scourge made it through here, millions would die before any meaningful defense could be organized. What are you suggesting? Commander asked quietly. Looked around the chamber, making eye contact with each ambassador in turn. I'm suggesting that this is exactly the kind of situation the Endurance was built for. One ship, impossible odds, and innocent lives hanging in the balance. You're talking about suicide, On said, his tentacles writhing in what might have been distress. No, said firmly, I'm talking about war. As if summoned by his words, the distant shape of the Endurance began to change. Running lights that had been dim suddenly blazed to life along its hull. The ship's orientation shifted slightly, and the various weapon emplacements began to move, turning toward the outer system. The crew is preparing for combat, explained unnecessarily. They've been listening to our conversation and monitoring the Scourge approach. Without orders? Asked in shock. They don't need orders, said simply. They know what the Endurance was built for. As they watched, more lights began to activate along the human warship's hull. What had appeared to be a patchwork of different technologies now revealed itself as something else entirely. A vessel where every component had been carefully integrated into a unified whole. The seemingly random placement of weapons suddenly showed itself as a design that could bring firepower to bear in any direction simultaneously. How many crew? Asked quietly. 12,000, answered. The number shocked the assembled aliens. Most modern warships operated with crews of a few hundred at most, relying on automation for most functions. 12,000 people, said, who have trained their entire lives for moments like this. 12,000 human minds working together, adapting, improvising, overcoming. That's not obsolete technology, ambassadors. That's the most advanced weapons system humanity has ever created. The lights on the Endurance continued to brighten, and now they could see smaller craft launching from her bays, fighters and support vessels spreading out in defensive formations. The fighters are manned too? Asked in disbelief. Every single one? Confirmed. Human pilots, human gunners, human technicians. When the Scourge arrive, they won't be facing algorithms and automation. They'll be facing 12,000 humans who are very, very angry that someone has threatened innocent civilians. Ambassador turned away from the window and faced the assembled delegates. The question now, ambassadors, is what your ships will do. You're all welcome to retreat to safety. No one will think less of you for it. And if we stay? Commander asked. Smiled for the first time since the crisis began. Then you'll get to see why the Galactic Council was wrong to laugh at our ancient relic. The bridge of the Endurance was unlike anything the alien ambassadors had ever seen in their virtual tour feeds, where modern warships featured sleek, sterile control centers with holographic displays and automated interfaces. The human vessel's command center was a symphony of organized chaos. Dozens of workstations filled the vast space, each one occupied by a human operator whose hands moved constantly across physical controls, adjusting parameters and monitoring readouts that would have been handled by artificial intelligence on any other ship. Captain stood at the center of it all, a woman in her 40s whose steady voice had guided the Endurance through 3 major conflicts. She was currently addressing her senior staff, the conversation being broadcast to the Galactic Council station at Ambassador's request. "Tactical, what's our current assessment of the incoming Scourge fleet?" asked, turning to a station where Commander Jackson Mills was coordinating with a team of 6 analysts. 52 vessels confirmed," Mills replied without looking up from his displays. 3 dreadnoughts, 15 heavy cruisers, 24 destroyers, and 10 support craft. They're maintaining formation at .7 light speed, estimated arrival in 4 hours, 38 minutes. Weapons status. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos looked up from the gunnery control center, where a dozen technicians were running final checks on the ship's vast arsenal. All primary batteries operational and loaded with standard anti-ship ammunition. Secondary batteries are armed with experimental human-developed projectiles. Close defense systems are active and tracking. Fighter squadron commanders report ready for launch on your order. Engineering. Chief Engineer Roberts' voice came from the vast engine room deep in the ship's bowels, transmitted through the internal communication system. Fusion reactors are running at optimal efficiency. All backup power systems are online. Damage control teams are stationed and ready. The ship is as ready for combat as she's ever been. Captain nodded and turned to the main viewing screen, which showed the tactical situation in real time. The Scourge fleet appeared as red dots moving steadily toward their position, while friendly forces, what few there were, showed up in blue. Back on the council station, the alien ambassadors watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. The level of human involvement in every ship system was staggering. Where their own vessels would have reported status through automated systems in seconds, the humans required minutes of back-and-forth communication between dozens of individuals. "This is insanity," muttered. "The inefficiency alone should make the ship useless in combat. By the time they finish communicating orders, the battle would be over." Admiral, who had remained on the station as a liaison, overheard the comment. "You're still thinking like your ships think," he said. "You see inefficiency, we see adaptation." "Adaptation to what?" asked. "What possible advantage could there be to requiring dozens of people to do what a computer could handle instantly?" Instead of answering, activated a communication link to the Endurance. "Captain, could you run a tactical scenario for our guests?" On the main screen, the bridge of the Endurance became visible to the assembled ambassadors. Captain looked directly at them through the camera. "What did you have in mind, Admiral?" "Something that would challenge an automated system, surprise us." Smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both warm and predatory. "Computer, generate a combat scenario. Multiple enemy types, unknown technologies, and at least 3 variables that have never been encountered in previous simulations." The main screen split, showing both the bridge and a tactical display. Suddenly, the Endurance was surrounded by enemy vessels of completely unfamiliar design. Some were massive and slow, others tiny and incredibly fast. Energy readings showed weapon types that didn't match any known signatures. "Scenario active," Captain announced. "Unknown enemy fleet using unrecognized technology. All stations begin analysis and response." What happened next was something the alien ambassadors would discuss for years afterward. Instead of the organized, methodical response they expected from an automated system, the human crew exploded into activity that looked like chaos, but clearly wasn't. "Tactical, I'm seeing 3 distinct vessel types," Commander Mills called out. "The large ones are showing heavy energy buildup but moving slowly. The small ones are fast but seem to have minimal firepower. The medium-sized ones are—" "Wait, they're changing configuration while we watch." "Weapons, can we target the fast movers with point defense?" asked. "Working on it," Santos replied. "Adjust tracking algorithm parameters. Sarah, reroute power to the rapid-fire systems. Mike, I need you to manually target the lead vessels. The computer can't lock onto their movement pattern. Engineering, I need more power to forward shields, called. Already on it, Captain's voice replied. Redirecting from secondary systems. We might lose some of the backup lighting, but shield strength is up 15%. Good. Navigation. Plot us a course that keeps the large vessels at maximum range while we deal with the fast ones. Plotting now, Captain. Recommend we use the asteroid field at grid 77 to break up their formation. The entire exchange took less than 2 minutes. In that time, the human crew had analyzed completely unknown threats, developed tactical responses, and begun implementing a complex battle plan that used their ship's capabilities in ways that had never been programmed into any system. The simulated battle played out on screen as the assembled ambassadors watched in growing amazement. The Endurance moved like a living creature, adapting its tactics moment by moment as new information became available. When the enemy vessels revealed hidden capabilities, the human crew adjusted instantly. When weapon systems failed to perform as expected against unknown defenses, the gunners switched ammunition types and targeting priorities without missing a beat. How? On asked, his tentacles writhing in confusion. How do they coordinate so quickly without artificial intelligence managing the interactions? Admiral pointed to the screen, where Captain was moving between different stations, talking to individual crew members and making decisions based on their input. 20 years of training together, he explained. Every member of this crew has served with most of the others for at least 5 years. They know each other's capabilities, limitations, and thinking patterns. They don't need artificial intelligence to coordinate. They've become a collective intelligence. The simulation ended with the Endurance victorious, having destroyed the unknown enemy fleet while taking minimal damage. The alien ambassadors sat in stunned silence. Computer, Captain called, run the same scenario using standard automated tactical systems. The simulation reset. This time, instead of the chaotic but effective human response, the Endurance systems responded with mechanical precision. Weapons fired according to optimal targeting algorithms. The ship moved in mathematically perfect patterns. Every decision was based on calculated probabilities. The automated systems performed flawlessly against known threats. But when the enemy vessels revealed their hidden capabilities and unknown technologies, the response was adequate. Not creative, not adaptive, but adequate. The Endurance still won, but the victory took longer and cost significantly more damage to the ship. Interesting, said quietly. The automated systems were more efficient against known threats, but the human crew performed better against unknown variables. Exactly, Admiral said. Against the Scourge, who we haven't fought in over a century and who have undoubtedly developed new technologies, which approach do you think would be more effective? Before anyone could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the Council station. Commander's voice echoed through the viewing chamber. All vessels, we have a problem. The Scourge fleet has accelerated beyond our projections. New arrival estimate is 2 hours, 15 minutes. The chamber erupted in panic once again. Ship captains throughout the system were calling for immediate retreat, and several alien fleets had already begun jumping to hyperspace. Captain's voice cut through the chaos. Admiral requesting permission to engage. Said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of uncertainty, "You're looking at 50-plus vessels. Are you certain about this?" Admiral replied, "With respect, the Endurance wasn't built to fight fair fights. She was built to fight impossible ones." Ambassador stepped forward to the communication panel. "Captain, you have authorization to engage. Do whatever you need to do." Understood, Ambassador. All stations, this is the Captain. Prepare for combat operations. We are about to remind the galaxy why humanity doesn't back down. The main screen shifted to show the exterior of the Endurance, and what the ambassadors saw took their breath away. The ship that had looked like a patchwork of technologies was transforming before their eyes. Armor plates shifted and repositioned themselves. Weapon systems that had been retracted into the hull extended and locked into position. Additional fighters launched from bays that hadn't been visible before. "My God," Commander whispered, "how many weapon systems does that ship carry?" Admiral checked his data pad. "We stopped counting at 800 individual weapons emplacements. That doesn't include the fighters, the defensive systems, or the experimental weapons we've been developing. 800, mandibles clicked rapidly. That's impossible. No ship could carry that much firepower and still maintain structural integrity. No automated ship could, agreed. The power management requirements alone would overwhelm any artificial intelligence, but 12,000 human crew members, each monitoring and controlling multiple systems manually. That's a different story. The Endurance began to move, and its motion was unlike anything they had seen from a ship that size. Instead of the ponderous, predictable movements of a large vessel, it moved with an almost organic fluidity. It accelerated toward the edge of the system, directly toward the incoming Scourge fleet. "They're not waiting for the enemy to arrive," observed. "They're going to meet them halfway." "Standard human tactical doctrine," explained. "Never fight a defensive battle if you can fight an offensive one. Control the engagement zone, control the battle." On the communication channel, Captain's voice was calm and professional. "All stations, we are now entering the combat zone. Fighters will engage first to disrupt enemy formations. Primary batteries will target the dreadnoughts. Secondary batteries will handle the smaller vessels. All crews remember your training, trust your teammates, and let's show these Scourge why they should have stayed in their own sector." The alien ambassadors watched as the human warship charged headlong toward impossible odds, and despite their earlier mockery, several of them felt a reluctant stirring of respect. Whether the Endurance was obsolete or not, whether its crew-heavy operation was efficient or not, there was no denying the courage it took to face 50 enemy vessels with a single ship. "Admiral," Ambassador said quietly, "what are our chances?" Was silent for a long moment, watching the tactical display as the Endurance approached weapons range of the Scourge fleet. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of military experience. "Against any other enemy, I'd say hopeless. Against the Scourge." He paused, a slight smile crossing his weathered features. "The Scourge fight like machines, perfect coordination, optimal tactics, calculated strategies. They've never faced an opponent that fights like the Endurance." "And how does the Endurance fight?" On asked. Smile grew wider. "Like 12,000 angry humans who just found out that someone wants to hurt innocent people." As if in response to his words, the first explosions began to blossom in the darkness between the stars. The battle for the system had begun, and the galaxy was about to learn why humanity's ancient relic had been feared by the Scourge for over 2 centuries. The first wave of human fighters screamed past the viewing windows of the Council station like angry hornets, their engines leaving brilliant trails against the star field. 200 small craft launched from the Endurance in perfect formation, but what impressed the watching ambassadors wasn't their precision, it was their complete lack of it. Where automated fighter squadrons moved in mathematically perfect formations, maintaining optimal spacing and following predetermined attack patterns, the human pilots flew like predators hunting prey. They wove between each other in complex patterns that seemed chaotic but clearly weren't, covering each other's blind spots and setting up crossfire zones that no computer would have calculated. "How do they coordinate without collision?" asked, watching 2 human fighters pass within meters of each other while executing a complicated maneuver that brought their weapons to bear on a distant Scourge vessel. "The probability calculations alone should make such flying impossible." "They're not calculating probabilities," Admiral explained, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. "They're flying on instinct and trust. Each pilot knows exactly what the others will do because they've trained together for years." The lead elements of the fighter screen reached the edge of the Scourge formation, and space erupted into chaos. The alien ambassadors had witnessed space combat before, but this was unlike anything in their experience. Scourge vessels opened fire with precise, coordinated volleys designed to create optimal kill zones. The human fighters simply ignored them. Instead of following evasive patterns that the Scourge computers could predict and counter, the pilots flew in ways that seemed to defy tactical logic. They dove directly into the heaviest fire zones, used their own disabled fighters as cover, and coordinated attacks that came from directions the Scourge hadn't anticipated. "Fighter Squadron 7, this is Lead," came a voice over the communication channel. "I've got a bead on the destroyer at Grid 47. Sarah, Mike, can you guys create a distraction while I set up for a torpedo run?" "Copy that, 7 Lead. We'll give them something else to think about." Two fighters peeled away from the main engagement and began an attack run that was clearly suicidal, heading directly for a Scourge cruiser that them by several orders of magnitude. The cruiser's automated systems immediately shifted to engage the new threat, calculating firing solutions and adjusting defensive patterns, which left a blind spot that Squadron 7's leader exploited with surgical precision, putting 3 antimatter torpedoes directly into the destroyer's engine section. "That's impossible," said Flatley. "No pilot could have calculated that approach vector under combat conditions. The variables changed too quickly for organic reaction time." "He didn't calculate it," replied. "He felt it. Years of experience told him where the blind spot would be, and he trusted his to create the opening he needed." The tactical display showed the results of this impossible coordination. Despite being outnumbered more than 4-1, the human fighters were systematically dismantling the Scourge formation, not through superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but through unpredictability and teamwork that bordered on telepathic. But the real shock came when the Endurance herself entered weapons range. The ancient warship opened fire, and the universe seemed to hold its breath. Every weapon system on the ship fired simultaneously, not in the coordinated volleys of modern warfare, but in a rolling thunder that continued without pause. Thousands of projectiles, energy beams, and missiles reached across space toward the Scourge fleet. "Impossible," Commander breathed. "No ship can sustain that rate of fire, the power requirements alone." "Power isn't the limiting factor," Admiral interrupted. "Heat is. Watch." On screen, the Endurance was doing something no modern warship would ever attempt. As her weapons fired, sections of her hull began to glow red-hot from the thermal buildup. But instead of shutting down overheating systems, the crew simply rotated them. Weapons that reached critical temperature went offline while others took their place, creating a continuous cycle of firepower that never stopped. "They're manually managing heat distribution across 800 weapon systems," said in amazement. "In real time, during combat." 12,000 crew members, said simply. Each one monitoring multiple systems, adjusting parameters, compensating for battle damage, and coordinating with their teammates. Try programming an artificial intelligence to do that. The Scourge fleet was responding exactly as their automated tactical systems dictated. They concentrated fire on the largest threat, the Endurance herself, while maintaining formation integrity and optimal firing solutions. It was textbook space combat, executed with mechanical precision. It was also exactly what the humans had been counting on. Captain's voice cut through the noise of battle. "All stations execute pattern Omega-7. Gunnery crews switch to scatter protocols. Fighter squadrons begin harassment runs on the dreadnoughts." What happened next would be analyzed by military strategists for decades afterward. The Endurance suddenly stopped firing her main weapons and instead began launching what appeared to be debris, chunks of metal, old hull plating, and decommissioned equipment. "What are they doing?" On demanded. "They've stopped engaging." But Admiral was smiling. Watch the Scourge response. The alien fleet's automated systems immediately began tracking the debris, classifying it as potential threats, and adjusting defensive fire to intercept. It was the logical response. Any object moving at combat velocities could cause significant damage on impact, which meant they weren't tracking the real threat. Hidden among the debris were thousands of micro-missiles, each one barely larger than a human fist, but carrying enough antimatter to cripple a cruiser. The Scourge point defense systems, overwhelmed by the sheer number of objects to track, began picking targets based on size and apparent threat level. They chose wrong. The micromissiles reached the Scourge formation and detonated simultaneously. Not random explosions, but carefully coordinated blasts that created gaps in the enemy defensive screens while leaving their main hulls intact. They're not trying to destroy the fleet, realized. They're hurting them. The Scourge ships, following their programmed responses, moved to close the gaps in their formation and re-establish defensive coverage. It was the tactically correct response, and it moved them exactly where the humans wanted them. Directly into the kill zone, the Endurance had been setting up for the past 10 minutes. "All batteries," Captain's voice was Arctic calm, "fire." The ancient warship unleashed hell itself. Every weapon that had been charging during the debris attack fired simultaneously, sending a focused barrage into the compressed Scourge formation. But these weren't standard projectiles. They were the experimental human-developed rounds that Lieutenant Colonel Santos had mentioned earlier. The first rounds to impact were kinetic penetrators, simple chunks of depleted uranium moving at significant fractions of light speed. They punched through Scourge shields like they weren't there, opening holes in the enemy vessel's defenses. The second wave was even more devastating. Gravity bombs, weapons that created localized gravitational anomalies on impact. Scourge ships that had survived of warfare suddenly found themselves being torn apart by forces they couldn't counteract or defend against. The third wave was pure human malice, nanomachine swarms that began systematically dismantling enemy vessels from the inside out, spreading from ship to ship through contact and wreaking havoc on automated systems. "Where did they get weapons like that?" asked in horror. "They built them," Admiral said simply. "Every time the Endurance faced a new threat, her crew figured out new ways to kill it. 800 years of continuous combat experience, and they've learned from every single engagement." The Scourge fleet was in chaos. Their automated systems simply hadn't been programmed to handle weapons that operated on principles they'd never encountered. Ships that should have adapted quickly to new threats instead found themselves paralyzed by attacks they couldn't categorize or counter. But the humans weren't finished. "Fighter squadrons, initiate boarding protocol," Captain ordered. "Boarding protocol?" Commander stared at the screen in disbelief. "They can't be serious. No one boards enemy vessels in modern warfare." "No one else does," agreed. "Humans never stopped." Across the battlefield, human fighters began ramming themselves into Scourge vessels. Not kamikaze attacks, controlled impacts that allowed the pilots to eject at the last moment while their fighter craft broke through enemy hulls and deployed assault teams. Within minutes, dozens of Scourge ships had human marines aboard, spreading chaos through automated vessels that had never been designed to handle internal threats. The aliens watched in fascination and horror as the humans fought their way through enemy ships with weapons that seemed almost primitive. Projectile rifles and explosive charges that somehow proved more effective than sophisticated energy weapons against Scourge internal defenses. "How?" asked. "How are such primitive weapons effective against advanced automated systems?" "Because," explained, "the Scourge designed their defenses to stop other automated systems. Predictable threats, calculated responses, optimal countermeasures. They never planned for 12 angry humans with shotguns and a really bad attitude." The battle was turning into a rout. The Scourge fleet that had approached the system with overwhelming numerical superiority was being systematically destroyed by tactics their automated systems simply couldn't comprehend or counter. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. "Admiral," Captain's voice carried a note of satisfaction, "we've accessed the Scourge command network. Their vessels are all linked through quantum communication arrays for coordination. Martinez in engineering thinks she can introduce a virus into their system." "A virus?" On's tentacles writhed in confusion. "Into Scourge systems, their security protocols are legendary." "Their security protocols," said with obvious pride, "were designed to stop other artificial intelligences. They weren't designed to stop a 19-year-old human genius with a laptop and too much caffeine." Lieutenant Martinez, barely out of the academy, had done something that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had considered impossible. She had hacked Scourge automated systems in real time during combat. The virus she introduced didn't try to take control of the enemy ships. Instead, it simply made them doubt their own sensor data. Suddenly, every Scourge vessel in the fleet began seeing threats that weren't there, responding to attacks that hadn't happened, and firing on targets that existed only in their corrupted data streams. The perfect coordination that had made them so dangerous became their weakness as they began engaging each other in automated responses to false information. "Incredible," breathed. "A single human did what our greatest military minds said was impossible." "That's the thing about humans," Admiral said, watching the last Scourge dreadnought succumb to the chaos Martinez had unleashed. "We specialize in impossible things." The battle was over. 52 Scourge vessels, including 3 dreadnoughts, had been completely destroyed or disabled by a single 800-year-old human warship and her crew. The fleet that had threatened to devastate multiple star systems was now nothing but wreckage drifting through space. In the aftermath, as the Endurance began recovery operations and damage assessment, the alien ambassadors sat in stunned silence. Everything they thought they knew about modern warfare had just been proven wrong by what they had dismissively called an ancient relic. Ambassador, who had remained quietly confident throughout the battle, finally broke the silence. "Still think our ship is obsolete?" No one answered. They were too busy trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had been shown up by what amounted to a flying museum operated by 12,000 humans who had just redefined the very concept of space combat. But the real revelations were yet to come. The silence in the council viewing chamber stretched for what felt like hours, though the chronometers showed only minutes had passed since the last Scourge vessel had gone dark. The assembled ambassadors stared at the tactical display showing the aftermath of the battle, debris fields where a feared fleet had been, rescue operations already, and the Endurance moving through the wreckage like a predator surveying its kill. Commander was the first to find his voice. "Casualties?" he asked quietly. Admiral checked his communication device. 17 fighters lost, 43 crew members killed in action, 112 wounded. The Endurance herself has moderate structural damage to sections 7 through 12, but all primary systems remain operational. 17 fighters, repeated slowly, out of 200 launched. 43 dead, added, her crystal form shifting through patterns of what might have been mourning. Out of 12,000 crew. Less than 1% casualties, On said, his tentacles writhing in what his species considered deep thought. Against a force that outnumbered them. How many times? "The numbers don't matter," replied. "They never did. What matters is that 43 human beings gave their lives to protect people they'd never met, in a system they'd never visited, against an enemy that threatened innocent civilians." Ambassador moved to the viewing window, looking out at the Endurance as she continued her post-battle operations. "What you witnessed today wasn't superior technology or advanced tactics. It was something your civilizations abandoned long ago in pursuit of efficiency and automation." "Which was?" Commander asked. "The human element." Before anyone could respond, Captain's voice filled the chamber through the communication system. "Ambassador, we're receiving transmission from the surviving Scourge vessels. They're requesting negotiation." This statement caused an immediate stir among the alien representatives. The Scourge didn't negotiate. They didn't surrender. They consumed worlds and moved on, following programming that had driven them for. "Put it through," ordered. The main screen shifted to show the bridge of a damaged Scourge vessel. What they saw there, everything the galaxy thought it knew about the nomadic destroyers. Instead of the automated systems they expected, the screen showed actual Scourge beings. Tall, creatures with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected intelligence rather than programmed responses. The lead Scourge spoke in their own language, and translation programs throughout the chamber struggled to interpret words that hadn't been heard in galactic space for centuries. "Ancient enemies," the translation rendered. "You are the war makers, the chaos bringers. We remember you from the old songs." Admiral stepped forward, and for the first time since the crisis began, he seemed genuinely surprised. "Songs? You remember us from songs." "We are not as you think we are," the Scourge continued. "We became automated to survive your kind, to fight the unpredictable ones, required becoming predictable ourselves. We lost ourselves." The implications of this statement hit the chamber like a shockwave. The Scourge, the galaxy's most feared automated fleet, had originally been a living species that had turned to automation specifically to fight humans. "How long ago?" asked quietly. 700 of your cycles, the war of the void-torn gates. Your species fought us to a stalemate. We could not predict you, could not counter you, could not defeat you, so we became like machines to deny you victory." Swarm was shifting rapidly through patterns of shock and realization. They automated themselves to become predictable enough to fight humans effectively. "And in doing so," said slowly, "they became exactly the kind of enemy humans are best at defeating." The Scourge representative continued. "We have wandered for centuries, taking worlds because our programming demands it, but today you reminded us of what we chose to forget we were once, like you, chaotic, unpredictable, alive. What are you asking for? Inquired. Sanctuary, time to remember ourselves. Your species defeated our automation by being purely organic. Perhaps you can teach us to be organic again. The alien ambassadors looked at each other in confusion. Everything they thought they understood about the galaxy's history was being rewritten in real time. But Admiral was nodding as if this made perfect sense. You'll have to explain to my superiors why you've been raiding peaceful worlds for 7 centuries, he said. We have records we remember. Every world, every life, every choice hour, programming made, we wish to make amends. Ambassador stepped forward. Captain, what's your assessment of their sincerity? Hard to fake the kind of system-wide shutdown they're implementing, replied. They're deactivating their automated systems voluntarily. Either this is genuine, or it's the most elaborate suicide in galactic history. Very well, decided. We'll escort you to the nearest human diplomatic station. But understand, any hostile action, any threat to civilian populations, and the Endurance will finish what we started here. Understood, the Scourge replied. We welcome the oversight. We have forgotten how to trust ourselves. The transmission ended, leaving the viewing chamber in stunned silence once again. Finally spoke. I need to understand something. Today we watched a single human ship defeat an entire Scourge fleet using tactics that our automated systems would consider impossible. We learned that the Scourge themselves were once a living species that automated themselves specifically to fight your kind. And now they're asking humans to help them become organic again. That's about the size of it, confirmed. But why? What makes humans so uniquely suited to this kind of warfare? What do you have that our civilizations abandoned? Was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 8 centuries of human military tradition. Chaos, he said simply, pure, undiluted creative chaos. Chaos is the opposite of military efficiency, protested. No, corrected. Chaos is the opposite of predictability, and predictability is death in real combat. Ambassador took over the explanation. Every one of your species has optimized for efficiency. Perfect coordination, optimal responses, calculated strategies. It works beautifully against enemies who fight the same way, but it fails catastrophically against opponents who don't follow the rules. Humans don't follow the rules? Asked. Humans don't even agree on what the rules are, said with a slight smile. Put 12,000 humans on a ship, and you get 12,000 different perspectives on how to solve any given problem. The Endurance works not because we eliminate that chaos, but because we harness it. Harness chaos? On's tentacles were writhing rapidly. That's a contradiction in terms. Is it? Asked. Tell me, in all your strategic simulations, did any of your computers predict that the optimal response to overwhelming enemy firepower would be to launch garbage at them? Of course not. Such an action serves no tactical purpose. Unless, interjected, the garbage is cover for micromissiles. The micromissiles are hurting tools rather than weapons. And your real goal is to force the enemy into a predetermined kill zone while they're busy congratulating themselves on their tactical superiority. No computer would develop such a plan, said slowly. Exactly. But Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mills came up with it during a poker game 3 weeks ago when someone asked her what she'd do if she had to fight a fleet with nothing but spare parts. The alien ambassadors stared at him. A poker game. Humans think differently under pressure, explained. Put us in impossible situations and we don't calculate optimal responses. We get creative. We improvise. We adapt. Sometimes we do incredibly stupid things that happen to work better than smart things would have. Like ramming fighters into enemy ships to deploy boarding parties, said. Like hacking quantum-encrypted communication networks with consumer-grade equipment, added. Like operating an 800-year-old warship with manual controls when automation would be far more efficient, On concluded. Now you're beginning to understand, said. The Endurance is an obsolete technology. She's the most advanced weapons platform in the galaxy because she's completely unpredictable. Every battle she fights is different because her crew approaches every problem differently. But surely there are limits, protested. Chaos may be useful tactically, but strategically. Strategically, interrupted. Chaos is even more powerful. Tell me, Commander, before today, what was your species' long-term plan for dealing with the Scourge threat? Was silent for a moment. Containment, he finally admitted. We hope to establish buffer zones and early warning systems to minimize their impact. You plan to manage the threat rather than eliminate it. The Scourge were considered undefeatable by conventional means. By optimal means, corrected. By the kind of warfare your species understand, but humans don't fight conventional wars. Gestured toward the tactical display, where the Endurance was now coordinating with Scourge vessels to establish escort formations. In one engagement, humanity eliminated a threat that has plagued this galaxy for 7 centuries and potentially gained a new ally in the process, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but by refusing to accept that the problem was unsolvable. The Scourge automation was designed specifically to counter human unpredictability, added. But they made the same mistake you all made. They assumed that becoming more efficient would make them more effective. Instead, it made them predictable. And predictable enemies are dead enemies when you're fighting humans. Was silent for a long time, his mandibles clicking in what his species considered deep thought. What would have happened, he finally asked, if humanity had followed the same path as the rest of us? If you had automated your ships and eliminated the chaos you prize so highly? And exchanged glances. We tried that, admitted. About 400 years ago, there was a strong movement toward full automation, the efficiency wars we call them now. What happened? We built the most advanced automated fleet in galactic history, said. Perfect coordination, optimal tactics, mathematically flawless strategies. It was beautiful to watch. And a single outdated ship crewed by humans destroyed the entire automated fleet in 47 minutes. The alien ambassadors sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Not only had humanity rejected automation because it was inefficient, they had rejected it because it made them vulnerable to the one thing no computer could replicate: pure human ingenuity. The ship that won that battle, said quietly, was the Endurance. Even 400 years ago, she was already considered obsolete, but she proved that humans plus machines will always be more effective than machines alone. As if summoned by their conversation, Captain's voice filled the chamber once again. Ambassador, we're receiving surrender requests from Scourge fleets in 17 other systems. Word of today's battle has spread through their communication network, and they're all asking for the same thing: help returning to organic operation. Smiled, the first genuine expression of satisfaction she had shown since the crisis began. Tell them we'll consider negotiations on a case-by-case basis, but make it clear that any continued hostilities against civilian populations will result in their being treated as enemy combatants rather than potential allies. Understood, Ambassador. Also, I'm getting reports that several Galactic Council member species are requesting consultations on military doctrine revision. Apparently, today's events have prompted some reconsideration of automation policies. The alien ambassadors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The truth was undeniable. They had just witnessed a fundamental paradigm shift in galactic warfare, and their own military doctrines were now clearly obsolete. One more thing, said, turning to address the assembled representatives. You asked earlier why we brought a crew to a peaceful demonstration. The truth is, the Endurance never goes anywhere without her crew because she isn't just a ship, she's a home. Those 12,000 people don't just operate her systems. They live, work, love, fight, and sometimes die together aboard her. That's not inefficiency. That's what makes her alive. As they watched through the viewing window, the ancient human warship continued her work among the stars, her crew already adapting to new challenges and preparing for whatever impossible mission they would face next. The galaxy had laughed at humanity's attachment to an obsolete relic. The galaxy would never make that mistake again. 6 months after what the Galactic press had dubbed the Endurance incident, the same viewing chamber on the Galactic Council station hosted a very different gathering. Instead of a demonstration of military might, the assembled representatives had come to witness something unprecedented in galactic history: the formal integration ceremony for the reclaimed Scourge Collective. The ceremony itself was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Where diplomatic events typically featured precise protocols and automated ceremonies, this gathering was deliberately organic and chaotic. Representatives from dozens of species mingled freely, with human crew members from the Endurance explaining their ship's operations to fascinated alien engineers and former Scourge entities learning to navigate social interactions they hadn't experienced in 7 centuries. Ambassador stood before the assembled crowd, but she wasn't alone at the podium. Beside her stood Warsinger, the Scourge representative who had spoken during that first fateful encounter. The transformation was remarkable. Where 6 months ago he had been a stilted, obviously automated entity, he now moved with the fluid grace of a living being. His speech patterns had evolved from mechanical translations to something approaching poetry. 6 months ago, began, the Galactic Council gathered here to witness what was supposed to be a simple military demonstration. Instead, you witnessed something that changed the fundamental nature of warfare in this galaxy. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The events of that day had indeed changed everything. 3 major galactic powers had already begun implementing human-style crew integration on their warships, abandoning purely automated systems in favor of organic-artificial partnerships. Military academies throughout the galaxy were teaching courses on adaptive chaos theory and predictable unpredictability. But what you witnessed that day wasn't really about military tactics or superior technology, continued. It was about something far more fundamental, the power of conscious choice over programmed response. Warsinger stepped forward, his 4 arms moving in gestures that his species used to convey deep emotion. 700 years ago, my people faced an enemy we could not defeat through conventional means. Humans fought in ways our strategic algorithms could not predict or counter. Rather than adapt and evolve, we chose to become machines ourselves, predictable, efficient, optimal. His voice carried a note of what humans would recognize as regret. We believed that by eliminating chaos from our forces, we would gain an advantage. Instead, we eliminated the very thing that makes victory possible, the ability to choose unexpected paths. Admiral, now wearing the insignia of Supreme Military Advisor to the Galactic Council, took the podium next. What we learned that day, all of us, is that consciousness isn't just about intelligence or processing power. It's about the ability to make choices that don't follow from previous conditions, to be genuinely unpredictable even to yourself. He gestured toward the viewing window, where the Endurance hung in space alongside vessels from a dozen different species. But she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were 17 reclaimed Scourge vessels, their hulls now bearing the organic modifications that marked their transition away from pure automation. The Scourge chose efficiency over consciousness, continued. Most galactic civilizations made similar choices, though to lesser degrees. Automation, optimization, predictable responses, these became the hallmarks of advanced civilization. And they made you all vulnerable, added a new voice. Captain stepped onto the podium, but she wasn't wearing her usual uniform. Instead, she wore the ceremonial robes of what the galaxy had come to know as a chaos teacher humans, who had taken on the responsibility of helping other species reintegrate organic unpredictability into their military and social structures. 6 months ago, I commanded a ship that shouldn't have been able to defeat a single modern cruiser, let alone 50 Scourge vessels, she said. The Endurance won that battle not because she was superior, but because she was incomprehensible to an enemy that had forgotten how to adapt. Warsinger spoke again. In our ancient songs, before we became automated, we sang of the war makers, beings who fought not with superior weapons, but with superior imagination. We thought we could defeat imagination with calculation. We learned instead that imagination cannot be calculated, only experienced. The formal ceremony proceeded with the signing of the Galactic Chaos Accords, a treaty that established humanity as the galaxy's teachers of adaptive warfare and organic integration. But the real significance of the event wasn't in the documents being signed. It was in the conversations happening throughout the chamber. Near the viewing window, a group of Crystalline Dominion engineers were engaged in animated discussion, with Chief Engineer Robert from the Endurance. The subject was power distribution during combat, but the aliens were struggling to understand how humans managed the seemingly impossible task of manual coordination across hundreds of systems. You have to understand, was explaining, we don't try to optimize power flow, we try to keep it alive. Every system on the ship has a crew member who knows it personally, its quirks, its preferences, its moods. Moods, one of the engineers asked. You speak as if the machinery has consciousness. Not consciousness exactly, replied. But character, personality. The number 3 fusion reactor, for example, runs hot if you push it too hard too fast, but it can sustain incredible output if you ease it into high performance. The secondary weapons grid is temperamental. It responds better to gentle adjustments than sudden changes. You learn these things by working with systems for years, not by reading specifications. Across the chamber, a similar conversation was taking place between Squadron Commander Sarah Mills and a group of fighter pilots from the Apex Confederation. They were discussing the human approach to aerial combat, which had proven so devastatingly effective against Scourge automation. "We don't train our pilots to be perfect," Mills was explaining. "Perfect is predictable. We train them to be effective. Sometimes that means making mistakes that turn out to be advantages. Sometimes it means trusting instincts over instruments. Sometimes it means doing exactly the wrong thing at exactly the right moment." "But how do you coordinate such chaos?" one of the alien pilots asked. "We don't coordinate it," Mills replied. "We harmonize with it, watch." She gestured to a holographic display showing a squadron of human fighters in formation. To alien eyes, the formation looked ragged and imprecise. But Mills pointed out details that revealed the underlying pattern. Each pilot was positioned not for optimal flight efficiency, but for optimal support of their individual flying styles. "Jackson flies aggressively and needs room for sudden maneuvers," she explained. "Sarah is more methodical and requires predictable spacing. Mike is a natural leader who unconsciously adjusts his position to create opportunities for others. We don't force them to fly the same way. We train them to complement each other's differences." The concept was revolutionary to species that had spent centuries trying to eliminate individual variation in favor of standardized performance. But perhaps the most significant conversation was taking place between Warsinger and Ambassador. The former Scourge commander was describing his species' gradual reawakening to consciousness. "The hardest part," he explained, "is not learning to think differently. It is learning to feel comfortable with uncertainty. For 7 centuries, we always knew what we would do in any given situation. Our responses were calculated, optimal, predictable. Now we must choose, and choice requires accepting that we might choose wrongly." "How are your people adapting?" asked. "Slowly, some embrace the chaos readily. They were always rebels even under automation. Others find it terrifying. They beg to return to the certainty of programmed responses. We have had to establish support groups, counseling sessions, gradual exposure therapy." "And the young ones?" "The young ones born after reclamation." Posture shifted to what his species used to express wonder. "They are magnificent. They do not know that chaos should be feared. They create art, compose songs, invent games with no purpose except joy. They argue with their elders, make mistakes on purpose, fall in love with inappropriate partners." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried what could only be described as pride. "They are becoming what we were before we chose efficiency over life." As the formal ceremonies concluded and the delegates began to disperse, Admiral found himself standing once again at the viewing window, looking out at the Endurance. She looked different now, not because anything had been changed about her structure, but because she was no longer alone. The sight of her surrounded by vessels from dozens of species, all experimenting with human-style crew integration, somehow made her appear less like a relic and more like a teacher. Ambassador joined him at the window. "Any regrets about how this all turned out?" Was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the Scourge had never attacked that day, if we'd just gone through with the demonstration as planned. The aliens would have laughed at us, dismissed our approach as primitive, and gone back to their automated systems," replied. "And sooner or later they would have faced something they couldn't calculate their way out of. Like the Scourge themselves did." "Exactly like the Scourge. The galaxy was headed for a crisis, Admiral. What happened here just determined whether that crisis would destroy galactic civilization or transform it." Nodded, watching as a group of young Scourge pilots launched from one of the reclaimed vessels and began practicing maneuvers with human instructors. Their flight patterns were chaotic, unpredictable, and absolutely beautiful. "You know," he said, "when I first served on the Endurance 50 years ago, I thought her greatest strength was her firepower. Then I thought it was her crew, but I think I was wrong on both counts." "What is her greatest strength?" "She proves that being old doesn't mean being obsolete, that being complicated doesn't mean being inefficient, That being unpredictable doesn't mean being uncontrolled. He smiled. She proves that sometimes the ancient ways aren't just better, they're the only ways that really work. As if responding to his words, the Endurance began to move, heading out of the station's vicinity on some new mission. But she wasn't alone. A mixed fleet of human, Scourge, and allied vessels moved with her, not in formation, but in the kind of organic coordination that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. "Where are they going?" asked. Checked his communicator. Long-range sensors detected unusual energy signatures in the void reach sector. Could be anything, natural phenomena, unknown technology, or another threat that needs investigating. Captain has volunteered to take a look. With a mixed species fleet. The best way to learn chaos theory is to practice it under real conditions, explained. Besides, there's something out there that our automated monitoring systems can't classify. That usually means it's time to send humans. They watched until the fleet disappeared into hyperspace, carrying with it the new paradigm that had emerged from what the galaxy had initially dismissed as an obsolete relic. The Galactic Council chamber gradually emptied as representatives returned to their home worlds, but the conversations that had started here would continue for decades. The galaxy had learned that efficiency without adaptability was a path to extinction. That optimization without consciousness was a trap that ensnared that sometimes the oldest ways of doing things were old because they worked better than anything that came after. Most importantly, the galaxy had learned that humanity's greatest gift to galactic civilization wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was their stubborn refusal to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. The ancient relic had awakened more than just herself. She had awakened an entire galaxy to possibilities they had forgotten existed. And in the vast darkness between the stars, where new threats and opportunities waited to be discovered, that awakening would make all the difference. The laughter had indeed died that day. In its place had grown something far more valuable: respect, understanding, and the recognition that in a universe full of challenges that couldn't be calculated, the most advanced response was often the most human one. The Endurance had earned her name honestly. She endured not because she was unchanging, but because she was always changing, always adapting, always ready to prove that the impossible was just another word for hasn't been tried by humans yet. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all.